Thank you, Mr. DPM. Really good that you were putting the emphasis also on this issue of the supply of infrastructure, the bankable projects. It's really very important. And also, I've heard lots of finance ministers talking about their bonds being underwater, but I've never heard a finance minister talking about his house being potentially underwater. So you've introduced as a new concept, a new concept of country risk. So if we're all feeling somewhat breathless, I think, after that amazing tide of statistics from Danai. So we're now going to go back to the higher ground of looking at sustainability and public investors around the world. I've got an excellent panel, Kristen Smart, who's already been introduced by Frank Scheide, who is from the Barings Investment Institute, a former member of the White House and also the Treasury under a different president to the present one. Chen Jingjing from the Asian Development Bank, new Vice President, so thank you very much indeed for representing the ADB. Mark Burgess from the Health Workers Superannuation Fund of Australia, former head of the Australian Future Fund, so a great force in sustainable investment, because I believe, Mark, many years ago, you pioneered the whole issue about getting rid of tobacco in some of the portfolios of the Australian and other funds, and I'm very pleased to say he's going to be our chairman for Asia Pacific, for OMFIF, from the 1st of July. Been very great help to us over the years. And then I'm very pleased to have Governor Zeti with us. When we started off OMFIF nearly 10 years ago, you were one of the first people who thought this idea might be sustainable. And so we're very, very pleased that you've kept with us, and now that you've stepped down from being the governor of Bank Negara Malaysia, you're now the chairman of PND, the Malaysian Mutual Fund. You have a huge stake in London as well through this very sustainable former power station in Battersea. But you're a big force in sustainable investments all over the world. So we don't have very much time because we have to get off in a bus to go off to IFC for the second half of the seminar. Good to start off with you, if I may, Governor Zeti. You've been pioneering for some years this idea about the Asian savings being intermediated in this part of the world, no longer being sent off to New York and coming back again. Do you think that Asian institutions as a whole have really married themselves to the concepts that we've heard the Deputy Prime Minister talking about, Frank Scheide, other luminaries, or do you think there's still quite an effort of persuasion and willpower to be carried out here in Asia regarding sustainable development by the investors?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say congratulations to OMFIF for their launch of their 6th annual Global Public Investors Report. I've watched over these 10 years OMFIF grow from strength to strength, and congratulations to you, particularly David, for leading it. And it brings together the central banking community, the global institutional investors, and multinational organizations, and it's an amazing forum. Well, being from the ASEAN economy and also emerging economies, I would like to start off, I'd like to make 3 points. And the first one is that ASEAN is increasingly having an important role in the global economy because we have chosen ASEAN integration rather than ASEAN unification. And that is the path that we have taken, and focusing on economic, political, social, and cultural cooperation. And I believe that we have an important platform in taking sustainability forward. ASEAN has become, as described, an anchor in the global economy, but it's also a stabilizing force in the global economy. And this has not only contributed to the stability of the region and stability of financial markets, but our that we are mutually reinforcing each other because of that integration process. Now, the point that you raised on the sustainability aspects of our investments, I think we are still at an early stage of this giving attention, but one of the ways that we have given attention to incorporating our considerations of sustainable development through our investments is through the governance process. And while we don't have the frameworks and the mechanisms for the screening of these kind of investments, it is through the governance process that we incorporate, that make strategies and investment decisions, take into account through audit, risk management, and composition of boards, and so on. Taken in a powerful manner in which sustainable development goals are incorporated in our investment activities, and this creates awareness and understanding of the impact of such investments and on the economy, on the community, and on the environment sustainability. It provides the clarity of outcomes that need to be achieved, the strategies to be adopted, and then a very important aspect of it is the accountability. So we believe that it is an effective manner for these issues to be given sufficient attention in organizations on the strategies that these issues and considerations are incorporated into the decision-making process, into risk management, and so on, that these considerations. And then the final point that I want to make is on the investment that we have made at PNB in your country, David, in Britain.
We're very grateful because that power station was a ruin, actually, for many years, and then the Malaysians came along and revitalized it.
Well, this is a long-term investment, and we have actually there a framework because on how to assess three aspects of the contribution to the economy, the value that we add, the value that we add to the community, and the value that we add to environmental sustainability. And that's really taken into account and monitored very closely. So on how we add to the economy is the amount of investments we have injected, the employment that we've created, the future income that will be generated, and the support given to local businesses, and the number of visitors and residents that have been brought in the retail business, and the infrastructure development that we contributed as well, like extending the Northern Line to it and so on, and then the procurement of materials. And then in terms of the community, the education, the internships, and wide-ranging activities in the public spaces and so on. So that's the adding to the community. And finally, on the environment, the air quality is being preserved and enhanced, innovation on the use of resources and energy, and then one aspect is we preserved a rare species of falcons. We actually took them away while the construction was going on, and then brought them back when the construction was completed.
I've heard of locusts in the City of London. I didn't know there were falcons in Battersea.
And energy usage and so on. So we are contributing in that respect on all the sustainable development goals. And we've built affordable housing in the vicinity as well. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for doing that for our country. A little bit of development assistance from Malaysia here. Could I swing over to Christopher now? Christopher, as I said, you worked at the White House. The present incumbent doesn't seem to be a huge supporter of efforts to combat climate change, but this is a flexible man who maybe can change his mind. Do you think that there could be anything like a universal approach towards combating climate change driven by these public investors, given the fact that the people in Asia quite fairly say, well, look, you people in the West, you have 200 years of economic development, you didn't care about the environment or about carbon emissions. You did all that without any constraints. You're asking us to do this development within, say, 30 years, and we have to pay attention to all these climate change issues. Indonesian coal might be an example. Is it possible to have a universality when it comes to investment standards for sustainability worldwide?
Well, David, thank you for the easy question. I think, so at the Barings Investment Institute, we try to look at long-term trends in investments, working with our investment teams to give them a broader perspective on economic and political change. And issues of sustainability, public safety are actually much more long-standing than you might think. It was 150 years ago, George Westinghouse invented the air brake for locomotives and decided that it was not going to be profitable for him to market this innovation to the railroad companies themselves, but he went around promoting public safety to communities that had railroads that had accidents and built a demand for improvements in public safety quite shrewdly through communities. And I think that's what we're responding to as investors right now, because we are seeing political direction coming from our governments, political direction coming from our investors. And when you say, are we able to move towards a universal standard? Probably not, but I think we'll all be moving in roughly the same direction, or at least I hope so. I think we as investors have to take direction from governments who set the rules and laws and incentives around which we invest, and as well as our investors themselves. And I think they are all sorting out how to meet these goals and how to create rules in which business activity and investment activity in particular will lead to progress along the way. I think our challenge as investors is, because what we do is to invest money, to integrate these concerns into what we already do. And at Barings, I think we have gone a long way to making, moving past negative screening lists or negative lists at the back end or screening lists at the front end, to try and look at the risks, the additional risks of each individual investment around things like climate change or other social issues. We have a system where we deliberately will adjust our equity risk premiums for certain investments where we deem the environmental, the social, or the governance risks to be higher. I think every investment firm has its own different way of trying to incorporate these things, but again, we're taking, I think, our cues from both our governments and our investors, and that is a rapidly evolving. When
you say our governments, are you talking about, might I say, the United Nations more than the government in Washington?
You're picking on my government again, aren't you?
Keep going back to that.
Well, I am not here to defend our particular strategy on climate change, but I think Frank pointed out quite correctly that there is still in our states, in our cities, and in our corporations really unrelenting efforts to grapple with this issue, in spite of what's going on in Washington, because I think there is a sense that whatever this administration may be saying right now, the next administration, the popular demand will be there to make these changes. Interestingly enough, one of the greater champions of making adjustments to climate change in the United States today is the United States military, which continues to list climate change as one of the principal threats to the United States national security. Because of both direct impacts of weather on our country, but also impacts of water, soil change, that sort of thing on national security threats around the world. So there may be more hope than you may be.
Well, that's very heartening. I think one can say this shortly after the 75th anniversary of D-Day, where we did rely very much on our American friends, and we were very nearly underwater then. I think Winston Churchill said the Americans will always do the right thing in the end after they've exhausted every other single possibility. So
we try to live up to our reputation.
So, Mr. Chen, could perhaps we could go on to the Asia Development Bank, because you've got an enormous footprint across Asia. We keep hearing about this great big long list of infrastructure projects that needs to be done. There always seems to be a gap. It always seems to be about 8 or 9 trillion. It never seems to get any smaller. We heard from the Deputy Prime Minister that there's not enough bankable projects. How much can you do as a development bank, together with other brethren? We've got the AIIB now, the new kid on the block, and we've also got the World Bank Group, and we have the EIB, which has also got a big loan book in Asia. How much can you do? You've got enormous force, but you do have to rely on the supply of projects. How much can you do in terms of getting sustainable infrastructure built in Asia?
Thank you for the questions. But first of all, let me also join to congratulate you for the publication. I think it's a very good annual book for clearly help us to understand the current situation about investment, financial capacity or things like that. I've been taking this position for half a year, so the experiences in my position, I'm in charge of South Asia and the Central West, totally 16 countries. Taking this half a year, I visited 6 of them. According to your question, sometimes I feel happy, sometimes I feel a big concern. The happy is that the country I visited, most of them are overperformance than previous years. But the big concern is still a lot of challenges according to the SDGs. The poverty is still there, inequality, specifically in rural area, climate change affected, and also some social problems like education, poor quality, and health as well. And also, sometimes my big concern is the implementation in some poor area, in some vulnerable groups. The project in there are really hard and time-taking. So this is like some corridors from one country to one board to another board. It's not that long, less than 600 kilometers, but it takes more than 5 years, 8 years to build it. So if you think about the SDGs, it's already 1/3 of time passing. It's only 2/3 of time in there, 10 years there. So if consider those things there would be extremely kind of concerns there. And also sometimes the financial resources is a shortage there. ADB and together with World Bank and other IFIs, I think it's a bigger the financial provider. Like in MDGs, during MDGs time, ADB roughly provided about 230 billion, annually 15 billion. Last year, 2018, it's about 21 billion ADB provided. Together with the co-financing, as you mentioned, we co-financing with other like MDBs and other institutions, it's a 14 billion. Lots of efforts should be there, like transport, like energy, specifically sustainable energy, and also social education, even like gender, climate change affected places. So a big task is there. But according to the situation, what I was concerned, where I visited, I think it's far more less. So needed big efforts. Like the IMF mentioned that up to now, annually at least needed to 2.5 billion additional in that. So those are the quite big challenges. But good news is like today, you mentioned that GPI, actually the investable fund is like 38 trillions there. So if the SDGs goes there, and also like UN PRI, can be fully implemented, I think that will be a big contribution to that. According to the MDG, according to the MDBs like ADB, I think because of the mandate, our mandate is poverty reduction and sustainable development. So I think all the resources from MDBs could be fully in line with the SDGs, 100%, I think. But the MDB, on the one hand, in my understanding, is the external, the institutional investor, part of our resources invested in the private sector. But at the same time, the point I want to emphasize is that MDB also is a good channel between the SDGs and the GPI, because we MDB fully aligned with the SDGs. So lots of efforts can be made through, channeled through MDBs, like the bond issued by the MDBs. Many years, ADB issued about 1.8 trillion, the thematic bond. Most of them are the green bonds, clean energy bonds. So this is the way. And also some specific arrangement, like World Bank, as you mentioned, they set up the global infrastructure facility. So they do the upstream and also invite the global public investors to join the investor in the infrastructure. So this is also kind of a good channel. And also like IFC Trust Fund, the MCPP, mentioned that manage the co-lending portfolio program. There's also the channel as well. And also some other instruments like B-loan, to can invite the private sector to participate in it, and also some guarantee. So those channels can be somehow coordinated together with the co-efforts through MDBs towards the SDGs. So this is I think MDBs like ADB can not only work by himself as for the SDGs, but also can join hands with the SARE effort.
Well, that's very heartening. I'm going to make sure that you write an article for the 2020 Global Public Investors where you actually explain all these acronyms here. And there will be like a dictionary of acronyms. But thank you very much indeed, because I can see things are really happening here. So Mark, let's go on to Australia now. Australia is always thought of as the lucky country, apart from when you play England at cricket, of course, when you... but you've always been thought of as having a bit of a throwaway attitude towards the environment, because you've got a lot of space and you can dispose of a lot of waste. That's all changing now, isn't it? And as I said, you yourself played a big role in the tobacco campaign a few years ago. Can Australia, improbable though it might seem, lead a sustainable crusade?
Thanks very much, David. Australia is much more beautiful than that. And in fact, to give you a sense, probably 40 years ago, you could swim in the Sydney Harbour because there were no sharks, but the water would kill you. The water was terrible, right? It was polluted. Today, it's so clean that you should not swim in the Sydney Harbour. It's beautiful to look at, but it's full of sharks. Sure sign of health. In fact, that's a common theme. Now I'm putting you off coming to Australia, but it's interesting about Australia. So Australia has about, as you would be aware, $2 trillion of pension money. And this isn't just in Australia, but sustainability, environmental social governance has become a very big focus. And in fact, as an investor, I've been an investor for over 30 years, every once in a while you get a fashionable trend that appears, the dot-com bubble or something of 2000. There's no doubt that globally there's a fashionable trend to get environmental, social governance and sustainability right. And I think that is a fantastic base. And Australia is participating in that. And I'm reminded about 4 or 5 years ago, I was in Montreal and I sat next to a very bright young female economist, and she was very impressive. She then for an hour told me that my generation had screwed things up. And I was her client, and I give her full credit for being honest. And what I find today is that even people of my generation and older are getting onto this wavelength. And we know that we're focused on it for a whole variety of reasons. First of all, if you take HESTA, for example, we are very, very active in sustainability. We're clear about our targets. We're fully engaged. We actively run the portfolios now and screen for issues like sustainability. But another test of it is that we're also checking to make sure that if people say the word sustainability or green bonds, they do it. And so, for example, the UNPRI, as you're probably aware, is putting pressure on their members now to actually do what they say they're going to do. We're also seeing phrases like greenwashing and other tests which are testing to see whether when we say sustainability, we're actually applying it. And I think this is very, very positive. We clearly have a lot of work to do. It is not for Australia to lecture other countries in any way, shape or form. But, if we're going to get future growth in the world in the next 20 or 30 years, we've got three of the best demographic countries in our region: Indonesia, Philippines, and India. And countries that are going through those growth phases have to be supported to allow them to grow and also get sustainability. So we need to balance and mix and match this so that we're both delivering sustainability and giving opportunity. And you'd be pleased to know, just to answer the question on Australia, this is now extremely fashionable. Almost all funds are doing it. Hester first started an eco pool in 2000, but now others are doing it. And so it's very common for our 2 trillion at least to be very focused on the issue. But most importantly, we're calling it out. We're saying, if you believe in sustainability, are you actually delivering on it? Are you actually doing it? And I think that's a very, very helpful thing.
Well, that actually brings me on to a question I wanted to put to Governor Zeti. But also I'd like to remind people that there are, I believe, microphones. We'd like to have a bit of audience reaction and audience interaction. So please do be ready to put a question or make a point in a moment. But first of all, just on to you, Zeti, Mark said it's not enough just to talk about it, but one has to do it. And we heard from Janai that central banks seem to do a lot of talking about this. You said they've made 20 speeches about this in the last year or so, but do they actually walk the walk? That is the issue. And you are still playing a big role, I know, in the central banking circuits, even though you've officially stepped down from being the governor in Malaysia. You still take part in the BIS meetings. I think people call upon your wisdom and your judgment and your experience a great deal. Do you think that central banks should get heavily involved in the whole issue about regulating green finance? Because there's this issue that maybe one should give so-called green loans lower capital weightings, lower risk weightings to somehow encourage these loans, even though it's not totally proven whether these loans do have lower default risk. There's also the question about green bonds. I think Frank Scheiding made the point last night that if all the central banks of the world wade into green bonds, bearing in mind there's only a relatively limited supply, that would just cause a huge bubble here. So is there a danger that central banks could get caught up in this fashion that Mark is talking about? I believe there's now 36 different central banks who are members of this so-called green finance network. It seems an awful lot. It's almost more exclusive to be not in the green finance group than to be in it. So is there a danger that the central banks could be part of a bandwagon here that could be actually quite harmful?
Well, no, I don't agree with that. Central banks have always had a longer-term orientation of its policies, and that's why independence of central bank is so important, because that it's not its policies are not based on short term. And when you talk of longer term orientation, it's all about sustainability. And so we have, particularly in the emerging world, focus on issues such as inequality, financial inclusion, and so on. And certainly with respect to green financing and environmental sustainability, many central banks have already issued guidelines to the financial institutions with respect to this, and they have participated in the development of financial markets, in particularly setting together, working with the Securities Commission, setting the framework that ASEAN has done for green financing. And Malaysia has made issuance, and I think Indonesia has also made issuance of such green bonds, meeting these standards that have been set by the ASEAN Central Banking and Securities Commission regulators. So yes, very much so. And to finally add that Islamic finance has it already directly embedded in the environmental sustainability. And just as it's written that if the world is Judgment Day is coming and there's just one moment left and you happen to be holding a shoot, that you should plant it. And also on future generations, you don't want to plunder the current environment so that there's nothing left for the future generations.
Well, that's very important. Thank you. Could we have a couple of questions maybe for the audience? We've got about 10 minutes left. Is there anybody who'd like to put a point? Frank Scheiding is putting his hand up. But could I just ask the gentleman here who hasn't spoken first? But your turn will come, Frank. So please, gentleman there with the glasses.
Good
Perhaps
morning.
you could stand up so everybody can see you and say who you are as well, please.
Good morning. I'm Abhishek Dangra from S&P. Thank you for the interesting discussion. And increasingly, we are hearing investors talk about sustainability and green. But at the same time, in the discourse, often some of them mention that probably sustainable investments are not giving them alpha, or returns necessarily are not positive or outperforming the market. So what are your views on that? And secondly, some are saying probably it's more for beta, that the volatility is lesser for these sustainable investments in the medium to long term. So it would be good to hear your views on that.
When I hear the words alpha, I think of Mark Burgess. Mark, that's your question. And then could we have the microphone down here, please, for Mr. Scheibig?
It's a really good question. All the funds take in Australia, but it's the same around the world, is that we have an obligation to effectively maximise risk-adjusted returns. And it's true that we work very, very hard to try and find sustainable investments that have alpha. They do exist. You have to work at it. You have to develop relationships with governments, for example. There has to be a real interplay to get the investments to work. One interplay, I'm optimistic about sustainability, but one area that I think is a challenge for all of us is that we must continue to have political stability, for example. That many of the projects we look at that we want to support and sustain are very long dated. And we live in a world where political stability is arguably up for grabs. Now, I'm more optimistic than that. But these are the challenges of doing sustainable investing. I think there is alpha, but you have to work at it. You have to be committed to it. And it gets to my point is that it's not just about joining the UNPRI or just having a policy. You actually have to be actively engaged. I will say one area, though, that I think is happening by osmosis or slowly. One of the great debates about this area is, should you exclude investments or should you engage to improve? And having been the CEO of the Future Fund, I'd have to go in front of the politicians and I'd be perpetually asked these sort of questions. And I think what we're proving is that by engagement with all corporates, asking them to show their use of carbon, to give us the data, to at least allow us to form a view, is by the process of asking those questions improving behaviour. And we've seen this globally, and I think we sometimes forget that. I say to people, take a photograph of 20 years ago and take a photograph of today, and you see dramatically improved behaviour. Why did that happen? That happened because of a constant round of asking people about improving their behaviours, getting information from them. And so there are ways to add alpha that we probably don't even measure, but I think is actually happening on a sustained basis. And then, of course, there's a lot of academic work in some emerging countries. Those with great ESG policies do clearly add alpha. It is clear that those investments tend to perform better. And so there is a scale here, but there's some of the takeaways.
It's exactly what the Australian rugby team does as well, get stuck in. That's basically what you do.
David,
very quick question here from Frank, and then there's one more from the audience, I believe. So, Frank, the quickest question you've ever asked in your life.
Well,
because we've only got 4 minutes left. And
so
get
it's
on
just
the bus.
2 minutes long then, Governor Zetti, I'm enjoying you now for the past 15 years almost, and you were always ahead the curve. You're building bridges between the Sharia and the international capital market scenery, and I guess also you're very wise acting in terms of sustainability investments. But isn't it right, if you see the rare good, and David passed the ball on to me, to my comments yesterday, I think the green or the sustainable bond markets are still very limited. You have roughly 1 trillion out in volume, and if a new issue comes, and I guess my colleague would say I'm right here now, you have to look into the books, because if you issue a new issuance, it's the responsibility of the issuer and the banks who bring these bonds to markets that the right investors financing it. And I'm glad you mentioned long-term investments that is sustainable. We have to make sure that these investments go to the right dedicated investors, because if you allow prop traders, hedge funds, and other fast money-making engines to invest into these rare goods, we will fail. We have to make sure that the right ones get allocated, and don't you agree with it?
So it could be a fairly short answer from Zeti here. I think there's one other person I'd like to just put the final, and then we'll all have a chance. I've got the feeling that Christopher wants to say, so please do, Zeti, please do answer. There's one more person.
I agree fully that that's very important, the allocation to investors, and we do keep an eye on that as well through the network. And the other thing that I did want to mention also was we have to monitor the utilization of the funds through the whole life cycle of the investment as well. That's equally important.
Good. Perhaps I'm making this up. I thought there was one more person from the audience, but no. Christopher, I sense that you're pregnant with an answer.
Well, I just wanted to follow on the question from our guest from S&P, because I think the points that were made earlier about the not just walking the walk, not just talking the talk, but walking the walk. What's so important is the measurement and the definition of terms. And I think we're getting help from ratings agencies in terms of identifying what is sustainable behavior. I think just like debt sustainability is often in the eye of the beholder, environmental sustainability can be a point of conversation among well-meaning people in terms of what is helpful in moving us in those directions or not. I think there was a Bloomberg columnist who recently suggested a new ratings system for green bonds where there would be emerald green and forest green and lime green to really sort of identify what is truly advancing the ball and what is maybe just moving us in the right direction. So I think particularly as investors, as we struggle to look for the incentives we're getting again from our investors, but what incentives there are in the legal and tax environments in which we work, defining terms as best we can in a rapidly changing debate is going to be very, very important.
Thank you. Mr. Chen, last word from you maybe. I mean, when will that gap actually start to fall, this 9 trillion that we keep hearing about? Will you come back next year and the gap will be smaller?
I just want to follow that questions. Maybe I can just say a few words about the sustainable development. So in terms of the idea of the MDGs, I think sustainable development should be some kind of DNA of its strategy. So strategy is very much important, like ADD 2030 strategy. So mention 4 things: progress, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable development. So this is put in the strategy. But more important is that, as you mentioned, how to measure that and how to put it into the operation, into the implementation. So our strategy is like we kind of thinking about the corporate result framework. So use the criteria to measure that in the details, and also set some targets that like we set up the climate change related operation towards 2030 has to be arrived at 75% of that. And in the operation, we just project by project, even like the TA, like private sector investment, we need to check all of them and to make sure finally we can reach that goal or not. So this is a kind of very strong sense about the sustainability, and then we work on it based on the project, based on the activities. Then I think it's maybe more achievable of the better efforts with that. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm going to give the last word to Governor Zeti. Oh, there's, well, just tiny question, really very small. And then you frame it as a question to Governor Zeti so she can answer it.
I'm Ian from DZ Bank. I thought it was pertinent for me to bring up a little comment first, drawing back to what Frank started this conference on. I have 2 twins. I have twins here, boy-girl twins. They're 3 years old. This morning they saw me wearing the suit to come for this seminar in Singapore's dastardly warm and humid weather. And since we're on this topic of sustainability, and I did raise it with Martin previously, all of us here are well suited. For Singapore's weather, on the topic of sustainability is a bit of an oxymoron. Okay? And this was pointed out by my 3-year-old son, because he saw me perspiring and he says, "Dad, why are you wearing the coat for?" A 3-year-old kid, right? So, and we don't sleep in aircon at home. But I thought I should mention that because at the end of the day, we are doing this for our kids. And all of us here, we are talking about these lofty ideas, but how do we actually execute them? And to the point on Zeti, Governor Zeti on Islamic banking, it's interesting you brought it up because I've been looking at Islamic banking for the longest time in my previous career as well. And I see the same trend that's happening in sustainable financing as well. This there was this fixation of sukuk at the early stages of Islamic banking. Now we are seeing this fixation with green bonds in the early stages of sustainable financing as well. So all of us always look at the bonds, at the capital markets, at the fixed income space. But at the end of the day, we saw Islamic banking grow and develop, and we went into the SME financing, where the loans are given out to the man on the street, to microfinancing, to small firms where they can do Sharia-compliant loans and financing. Do we actually see that same trend going forward? If we always look at the bond sector, the capital markets, green bonds, these are segments that only appeal to large listed entities. The smaller SMEs do not have that bandwidth.
Very good question. So, Zeti, you're going to be put on the spot whether this can apply to the SME. So you've got the final word.
One of the sustainable development goals is dealing with eradication of poverty, inclusion, inclusive growth, and so on. And therefore, yes, both in conventional and Islamic finance, there's a great focus on SME, small businesses, supporting small businesses with financing. So that's a categorical yes.
So I do hope your 3-year-old son would have approved of the answer. Also, just my final question. Please, yes. But not too long, please, Mark.
Very brief. Sorry, I had meant to say in my comments, the one theme about the sustainability or generally is that we're all in it together. This is a public good problem. And as I say to the university students who I mentor is that don't learn finance, learn cultural interaction. And with the Deputy Prime Minister here, I wanted to congratulate Singapore because I know much is being asked of Singapore, but Singapore has such a strong role to play in bringing cultures together on a consistent basis. And that is really the only solution. We as institutions can encourage it, but we need to be able to work across the cultures. And so I just wanted to, I had meant to say before, congratulate Singapore.
Well, thank you, Mark. That's really very well said. Actually, I wanted to put a final question to Zeti, which also applies to the Deputy Prime Minister, because I know from time to time there has been the occasional hint of some sort of rivalry between Malaysia and Singapore when it comes to financial centres. Goodness knows where I got that idea from. But do you think, in the presence of the Deputy Prime Minister, that Singapore and Malaysia can work together shoulder to shoulder in the way that Mark is suggesting to combat climate change?
That has to be the way forward because and we are in close proximity, not only physical location, but we are so highly integrated. If something happens in Malaysia, it will have significant spillover effects on Singapore and in the reverse as well. And it requires greater engagement and greater understanding. We may have different objectives that we want to achieve, but I think we need to focus on what is the greater good for the region in particular. And it's not just between Singapore and Malaysia. I believe that if we collaborate in ASEAN in particular, we will be a great force to be reckoned with, and in all the areas that we have discussed today. Thank you.
Good. Well, on that fraternal or sisterhood note, also I'd like to say that, as you know, Britain is leaving the European Union, but we are applying to join ASEAN. So I'd like to say thank you very much indeed to all the panelists, so Christopher, Jen, Mark Burgess, Governor Zeti. Thank you very much again, Chong Zeng, also for giving us such a good introduction. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister. Thank you, everybody, for playing a part here. Be back again on the 10th of June, 2020. Thank you very much indeed.